Welcome, Doug. We have a tight 25 minutes here, so we're going to jump right into it. There's
You got it.
three areas that we really want to dive into. Just your background perspectives from your really interesting career, culture and talent. It's something that, as the industry is moving and changing into a software business, has become a huge priority for everybody. And then just technology trends and strategies, like what's happening in China and what's happening broadly in the industry. So just maybe for everybody, your quick background, your own career highlights. As you look back, what are the most formative experiences that you had that help you in your role today?
Yeah, that's always a good question. Looking back, it seems all orderly and meaningful, but many of the choices were, I hated what I was doing. I needed to find something else, probably like a lot of people here. I worked in the medical industry for a while, which was very helpful in working on products that, done wrong, kill people, and were done at high volume. I spent time in the auto industry way back in the early 90s, which was quite formative. A huge experience.
At Ford?
Yeah, at Ford, actually. A hugely formative experience was at Segway and building a team and building what was in the year 2000 a completely software-defined drive-by-wire electric vehicle. So that was quite the privilege. And then Apple, I've learned so much about excellence and design from Tesla on speed and innovation, and now trying to put it all together with Ford.
How is the industry, from your vantage point as being a technical leader, changed from your first time at Ford to now currently?
It'd be easier to have a conversation on what hasn't changed. I mean, the industry, what's happening in the industry is just really shocking, even to me, particularly the last year. So Ford is a much more humble place than it was back then, which was a prerequisite for me joining, and has a much greater sense of urgency to change. I would say that is the fundamental difference. That is also what brought me back.
Is that coming from leadership? Is that coming from just how fast the industry is changing? What do you think is the root of that?
Well, it's definitely coming from leadership, but it's based on facts. And if you talk to the organization about what's actually happening, I mean, it is undeniable that Ford is going to have to change completely. So it's a pretty tough thing to argue against. So there's an easy platform for senior management to drive that. And I think most people, they want to change, they want to be a part of it, but it's super scary. It's super scary, and the winner's success is not guaranteed for any OEM.
That's a great way to put it. In this kind of big transition, sometimes there's kind of some shallow analysis that happens, and so one of those shallow analysis is like, hey, the cars are becoming phones or they're becoming tablets. You've said before that they're much more like robots. Why do you think that, and what's the implication for the engineering leaders in the room in terms of not saying, hey, these are tablets and these are more like robots?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really big missed opportunities when you talk about vehicles as an iPhone on wheels. One of them is around the interior experience, which you can create something completely different than you can with a device. And the other is, if you leave the actuators out of the thinking on a software-defined vehicle, you are not going to have autonomy integrated with user experience. You are not going to use the actuators on the vehicle to actually create experiences. So there's a huge missed opportunity if you narrow the scope of what we're doing with software down to that little piece of it.
What this term software-defined vehicles, I think if you ask 5 leads in the industry, they'd all have kind of a slightly different view. What do people get wrong about that, and what do people get correct?
So I think people spend all their time talking about the end state, and not the building blocks of being a company that drives a software-defined vehicle. it starts with talent and it moves up through development processes and all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, you can measure whether a company gets it or not by how soon software comes into the conversation on a new program, a new vehicle program. How early does that discussion start? And you can watch very carefully and say, how many times is the conflict between a software platform and a vehicle program going one way versus the other? If you want to look at output, that's how you tell whether an OEM understands what a software-defined vehicle is how front and center do you put it at the very beginning of your product development process.
How do you deal with a situation that vast majority of the automotive industry and trucking and construction mining, the CEOs are not software people, right? And so now they're trying to somehow manage these conflicts between, let's say, the program and software. How do you reconcile that in your own internal conversations? Is it just who yells the loudest, or what's the process of explaining to fundamentally mechanical engineers that, hey, we have to develop this product in a fundamentally different way?
Well, using the loudest voice is a road to ruin, as everyone here knows, for technology. That is a strategy that actually can work. It can work in crisis, and it can work in incremental execution, which is why it's still present.
Yeah, I mean, in Tesla, right.
Which part of this do you want me to touch on? I know we have little time.
Yeah, I think so many leads are
leads are the people who have to write software. Well,
yeah,
we'll do both. So the first is I think the leaders of OEMs are not going to all of a sudden flip and be software people. There's two kind of jobs in a big OEM. There's management and there's leadership, and part of leadership is technology leadership. But the management job is immense at an OEM, keeping the trains running, keeping quality and cost in check. And so the people who have built their career on that have to become completely dependent on some very weird and uncomfortable people.
Yeah.
And that's, if you watch, that's very scary for the leaders. Some have great intuition, like Jim, and are just voracious to learn about it, and therefore can find the right people and interact with them. But there's others for whom that's an expression of corporate weakness to do that internally. And so you get down to a certain level where there has to be a deep software expert running the show. And how far down the leaves of the tree you have to go before you hit that person tells you whether things are changing or not. The path to leadership in a traditional OEM has been general management. Go everywhere, learn a little bit about everything in order to rise to the next level and run more things. And
in areas you might not have any experience in.
And Silicon Valley is built on experts leading experts. People who deeply understand the technologies that their teams are working on and can guide them and lead them.
Yeah, let's shift gears a little bit. Culture and talent. This is what is culture to you, and do you think it's possible to reprogram? Whether you're taking a Silicon Valley engineer and putting them into an OEM, and kind of what are the big hurdles? Because I think so many folks in the room and broadly in the industry, they're making that transition from an automotive background into software, or software background into automotive or construction or defense. What does culture mean, and how do you kind of enable your own teams to make those transitions, and what's working and what's not working?
I mean, culture ultimately becomes defined by a set of values that drive how you treat people, how you reward people and have them get greater influence over the organization, how you manage people that don't fit. So, I mean, the culture clashes are just immense. You just go between California and Michigan, and you start with a massive cultural clash. Like, you get on WebEx, and There's someone like me who's used to like these high bandwidth conversations and interrupting constantly, and I'm the rudest person in the earth in the Midwest, where people are like, "No, I'm sorry, I spoke over you." So it's from the very beginning, and I think the key to making it work is you can't mix and homogenize the cultures. It's not going to work. I mean, there's folks doing their work at Ford and doing it in an expert way who have been working at Ford longer than any of the companies I've been a part of have been alive.
Yeah.
They've been at Ford for 30 years, 40 years.
Does that mean, do you isolate Dearborn to Dearborn, and you have a Bay Area office, and they rarely, how does that work in practice?
So locations are about getting the right talent. That's it. So there's only one exception where we've kind of pushed on isolation, and that's the Skunk Works, which is a very separate strategy. But the goal should be to understand these two cultures and to respect what each is going to bring to the conversation. And to one of the tools I try and use is just to get people to laugh about it. There we go. Like, that's the Silicon Valley way of approaching this. And if you can get people to define and recognize the difference in the people and the approaches, like one of the things I do when I have a senior software person that arrives in Dearborn for their first visit, they go to a stamping plant.
Yeah.
And they look at a stamping die. And usually their eyes get big and their jaw drops, and they think about lead times of hardware very differently.
Yeah.
And then you have to do the same thing with folks that have been there a lot of time, is expose them to how fast software can move, and how you make decisions based on uncertainty in software so much differently.
When you're interviewing leaders, one of the big things in the Bay Area, at least for us, is we want managers that can recruit and can effectively kind of build their own organizations. When you're interviewing senior executives, you have these giant teams. That's also a big hallmark difference between Detroit companies and Bay Area companies. Tend to be pretty small footprint.
Right.
There you have these multi-thousand person organizations. When you're interviewing very senior folks who are either working for you directly or very senior at Ford, what are kind of the non-negotiables, regardless of where they're coming from, in terms of the cultural mix that you want to have in your organization?
Yeah.
And it's very personal, but
that's great. I think there's some universal things, like respect and humility and great passion for the mission, that are non-negotiables. I think as you get outside of that into the different roles, it changes a little bit. In my organization, what I have to find are people that are deep in a discipline. And it's a discipline that they take ownership for and have responsible for evolving Ford, moving forward on the technology side. But they have to have some way of dealing with complexity. Otherwise, we just chop off the legacy business and start a new division. So finding people that can come in and not become completely overwhelmed by the number of products we ship, the number of products that are already in the field that we have to support, all the different suppliers that are in each of those products, all the regions we ship to, the partnerships where we build vehicles with other people.
Dealership dynamics, union dynamics, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's completely overwhelming. So someone that can kind of understand that and figure out a mechanism by which that gets managed and doesn't overtake why they're here in the auto industry. Because somebody coming out of Silicon Valley and taking on that complexity, they can't hold a candle to somebody who's grown up figuring that out.
So from what we're hearing, you do your fundamental pattern matching is the Silicon Valley. Hey, be an expert at some function so you can really lead the team in that organization rather than being purely a general manager who's good at managing the organization.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that that's completely absent from large OEMs, or in a lot of ways you can just say large companies that have been around a long time.
Yeah.
I don't want to sort of isolate either Ford or, in a lot of ways, OEMs. But another way you connect these two cultures is to respect that in mature disciplines, there are masters, and what they do is beautiful in understanding spring back on a stamping die and the material and the flow. I mean, and so if you look at excellence on all the dimensions, and you recognize that some excellence is from years and decades of experience, and there's respect there for that. The hard thing is finding those people, because they aren't necessarily the people that have been brought up into leadership. They very often don't want to, and they're not interested or capable in going the general management route.
Yeah, I think in the Bay Area, this concept of tech leads that become very, very senior is actually very different in traditional automotive, where that's not a known concept.
Yeah, or really any business that's in a very, very mature industry.
Yeah.
So if the way you win is by being 2% less expensive, 4% better fuel mileage, a few more features, an extra star on a crash rating, that is just a very, very different way of competing than putting somebody in charge of thousands of people and saying, you better have a breakthrough that's like 10x versus your competition.
Yeah, I think one of the having myself, I worked for 7 years in Michigan and then working here at Google. One of the big I would say surprises is there is an arrogance in the Bay Area sometimes, and I think it's rooted in. I would say this at Google all the time. It's not that the engineers in Michigan are not as good engineers. They're just good at different things, and they work in lower margin businesses. And you can't conflate the fact that you work at a high gross margin business, meaning that you're actually a really strong engineer. And I think we've seen that culture clash as well, where humility is such a core thing and then on the Michigan and Detroit side, and broadly the automotive industry globally, having the skepticism of Silicon Valley and saying you don't know how hard safety critical systems are. So I think humility is a really important thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other part of it is again finding those people.
How do you find these people? Let's say you're out in an executive search. How do you recruit people and find people to work for your team?
Well, one thing I've realized is that internal and external recruiting at Ford for me are the same thing. So the people that can be guides for me towards people I've never even met, that turn out to be like incredible people by Silicon Valley standards. So you have to make sure you're recruiting inside the company, because the reality is you know as little about some of the experts there as you do the ones you're going to pull in from outside the company. Yeah. And it's also really important for the company to see that there's people participating and rising. But I was in an EV reviews where I was asking the same question over and over about permanent magnet versus induction, and nobody could answer in the meeting. They didn't know why we'd pick that. And one of the things that's really important to me is, hey, I might disagree with the criteria, but you better be intentional, and you better have done it right against the problem you picked. And no one can answer. And I finally, by chance, got to meet this person who was in RNA, and he stood up at a whiteboard and he went through and in 2.5 minutes, I'm like, okay, I get it. But he wasn't in the room.
Yeah.
So that's the internal side. And then on the external side, it's there's a lot of people who like the idea of working at Ford. They have someone in their family that has always owned Fords. It's romantic. Doing the iPhone 16 is starting to feel a lot more boring than, hey, I get to work on cars and drive cars.
I mean, cars are just such an emotional experience.
Yeah, exactly. So again, you find people with deep expertise in a field that is core to this change that we're undergoing. They have the humility to be a part of it. They know what they're getting into. One stage I always go through at the end is I try and talk people out of it.
Yeah.
And do it in a very real way. Like, I've been thinking about this. I don't think you should take the job.
Yeah.
And I'll go through it over and over. And if they bounce back, okay, then they're probably going to have the grit to deal with the massive challenge and complexity of what the auto industry is today.
Yeah, let's change gears again. Technology trends looking forward. There's been a bit of a pullback in autonomy. If we were doing this event 2016, 2017, many companies funded for many billions of dollars. A bunch of them are no longer here. What do you think has happened in the space from your perspective? This is more on the L4 side. We'll talk about L2, L3 in a bit. But what do you think about full autonomy? Waymo's done kind of the geographic expansion up in San Francisco, where not only does it go down to Daly City, but anybody can use it. So what are your early thoughts there?
Well, I think to start with, everyone has to realize that L4 has been solved. This is all a question of ODD.
Yeah. Operational design domain.
It's where the vehicle can operate. But there are plenty of places where you can show that the problem's solved. They're just not very big or interesting for either customers or a business of robotaxis. So everything is about building the robustness of the technology to deal with the just shocking levels of variation in the real world. I think we're coming back. We've kind of bottomed out the trough of disillusionment, and I think we're starting to come back out, and people are starting to get demos and experiences that are really amazing. I think, though, that the way the industry is doing this right now is fundamentally unstable. In many ways, this is one of the hardest technical problems of our time. In some ways, I'd rather work on the problem to put somebody on the moon. It's hard, but at least it's known.
You only got to do it a couple times,
and it's physics, right?
Yeah.
But the idea that there should be 12 people trying to figure out how to get to the moon, I mean, this is shockingly expensive. And it is a tremendous amount of waste going to be created if everyone gets to the finish line, at which point there's going to be a reckoning anyway. Someone's going to have the breakthrough on the combination of performance and cost. And
that's really where we're at now. It's just performance and cost. Yeah.
So I think we're in an unstable situation. There will be consolidation. It can't be avoided. And
what do you think is going to happen in the L2, L3 space? Do you think L3 is going to happen? What's the obstacle to make it a reality?
Yeah.
Kind of on the passenger consumer side.
Yeah. Well, again, if you start with L3 is basically L4 for a specific amount of time with a specific time of notification for the driver to re-engage in L2. So that's L3. And that can be a pretty tight ODD, and it can still be a lot of value to the customers. So I think L3, more and more talent who've been trying to solve the big problem are going to have influence in L3.
Yep.
We did that back when we dissolved Argo.
Yep.
And brought the technical team in-house. They've been working hard on L3, but the reality is a lot of that work, a lot of that expertise is right now making L2 Blue Cruise better.
Yeah.
Lightweight perception stacks, things that give us in-house capabilities. So I think the talent is going to start moving
down the stack.
Yeah, and you've seen some of that happen at Cruise, and I think that's a trend. That's a trend.
Speaking of, there are some super impressive systems in China. What do you think about the Chinese auto market? What is different about that market versus kind of the traditional U.S. market from your perspective? Ford has business there, and you have research and development out there as well.
I would say being terrified about what is happening there is a sign of very good judgment. The speed at which they develop new products, the cost that they are delivering them at, understanding how that cost is generated and what parts of it we can harvest is really, really important. On the digital side, they have a couple of benefits. One is the consumer electronics companies are very, very interested, to the point where, both Huawei and Xiaomi are building
Their own cars, yeah.
building cars. It's a hobby in our country. Google, Android Automotive OS, and CarPlay. They're fantastic products, but they're a hobby.
Yeah, Sundar doesn't wake up thinking about.
Yeah. So, looking at what's happening on the digital side, it's like if you're in digital, you have to study China because for the same reason, if you were a geneticist, you've got to study fruit flies. Things are happening so fast. The mutations happen, they get thrown at the wall. Customers like or they don't like it. You see a brand or a product go down, dies, never hear about it again. So the number of companies fighting for customers and the number of things that they're trying, the Chinese customer is very much open to new technology in ways that we aren't here. You have to study it. Now, I think what's going to be really interesting is how much of this is coming our way. On the vehicle side, they're already in Mexico selling a ton in that market, and there's no doubt that directly or indirectly, the cost profile, however it ends up translating outside of China, is going to be a threat in this country. On the digital side, there are huge barriers to this making it into our market. Huawei, let's put software from Huawei in a car. If you're upset about a balloon with a camera attached to it over Iowa, imagine letting in tens of thousands of cars with cameras and LiDAR all over them connected to the cloud back to China. Get your priorities straight on what to worry about.
Last question. I know we're a little over time here, but the thing that, we're in Google country here. Computer History Museum probably sits on Google land.
One of my favorite places in the world.
Sundar, he might not be thinking about Android automotive every day, but he's thinking about AI.
Yes.
That's core. How is your organization thinking about AI, and how's Ford broadly thinking about kind of these massive advancements? We have a bunch of professors later talking about some of these topics, but what's the impact to Ford and to your programs?
Since we're short on time, I'd say the connection to autonomy is obvious, and you can't solve the problem without it. And those are where some of our very best people in the company are. The two other things that I'm excited about are, one is AI for the customer related to the vehicle in ways that demystifies technology. Cars are getting very hard to deal with for a significant portion of the population. And
too many features, too many menus.
Just overwhelm. I don't know how to deal with all of this. And people. I mean, if you go to JD Power, the number 1, 2, 3, and 4 complaints across the entire industry are in device interaction and infotainment systems. It's shocking.
And that's synonymous for consumers. That's synonymous to quality.
Exactly. And then the last place I'm very excited is in how we work way beyond the boundaries of just being efficient, generating code, things like that. The way it feeds the product development process as an augmentation of creative work is really cool.
So maybe some Ford designs will be coming out of that. Doug, thank you so much for the time. We appreciate it.